James and Nina stood at the airport check-in counter, their laughter weaving through the bustling terminal. Their tickets in hand, they talked excitedly about their dream vacation, a getaway they had been saving for years. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Nina adjusted her sun hat, her eyes sparkling with anticipation, while James, carrying their modest luggage, joked about finally unplugging from work. The airport was alive with activity. Families rushing to gates, business travelers focused on their laptops, and children tugging at weary parents. James and Nina felt a collective buzz of excitement, a shared human rhythm of journeys beginning. As they passed through security, James chuckled at the overly meticulous guard who seemed to take his time examining their belongings. "Guess we're the chosen ones today," he whispered with a wry smile. Nina nudged him playfully, though her expression hinted at unease. At the gate, they found seats and settled in, flipping through travel brochures and chatting about the sights they couldn't wait to explore. A little boy toddled over, dropping his toy. Nina bent down, picked it up, and handed it back with a warm smile. His mother offered a quick thank you, her tone polite but distant. James noticed the subtle hesitation, but Nina brushed it off, focusing instead on their plans. When the boarding call came, James grabbed their carry-on and held Nina's hand as they approached the gate. The attendant scanned their tickets with a cursory glance, her expression unreadable. As they entered the plane, Nina exhaled, trying to shake the faint unease that had been building. Their seats were toward the middle of the plane. As they placed their luggage in the overhead bin, James noticed a fellow passenger struggling to lift a bulky bag. "Here, let me help you," he offered, his voice kind. The passenger mumbled a quick thanks, but their eyes didn't quite meet his. Nina sighed too and gently squeezed James's arm, urging him to sit down. As more passengers filled the cabin, Nina couldn't help but notice the glances. Some were fleeting, while others lingered just a second too long. A few whispers floated around, indistinct but carrying a familiar weight. She exchanged a glance with James, who gave her a reassuring smile, though she could see the tension behind it. Once everyone was seated, a flight attendant came down the aisle, her sharp gaze sweeping the rows. She paused briefly near James and Nina, her lips tightening. Leaning toward another crew member, she whispered something that Nina couldn't quite hear. The attendant's eyes flicked back to them before she moved on. James tried to lighten the mood. "Let's just enjoy the trip," he said softly, placing his hand over Nina's. She nodded, forcing a smile. But the air felt heavy. The plane door closed with a mechanical hiss, sealing them inside. As the flight attendant continued her rounds, her cold demeanor left an unspoken tension in her wake. Nina couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, though she couldn't yet name it. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, James leaned back in his seat, gazing out the window at the airport bustling in the fading evening light. Nina clutched his hand a little tighter than usual. Though they tried to settle into the journey, an odd energy seemed to pulse through the cabin. Subtle, but unmistakable. The flight attendants moved efficiently up and down the aisle, performing last-minute checks. When one of them passed James and Nina, her demeanor shifted. Her smile vanished, replaced by a hard look that lingered a moment too long. Nina noticed it and raised an eyebrow at James, who shrugged, trying to dismiss it. Moments later, the same attendant returned, this time stopping directly at their row. She glanced down at their carry-on bags tucked neatly under the seats. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "Those bags are obstructing the aisle. They need to go in the overhead bin." James frowned but stayed calm. "Ma'am, the bags are under the seat in front of us. There's plenty of space." The attendant's tone grew colder. "I said, they need to be moved. Now." Other passengers began to look their way, their curiosity piqued. Nina felt her cheeks flush as James nodded politely and stood, moving the bags to the overhead compartment. As he did, another passenger muttered, "Rees or rees," under their breaths, loud enough for Nina to hear. She stiffened, biting her lip. James sat back down, his calm demeanor masking his growing frustration. Nina whispered, "Why didn't she say anything to the others? I saw at least 2 people with bags just like ours." James squeezed her hand. "Let's not make a scene. We'll get through this. The flight attendant, seemingly satisfied, moved on. But the air around them remained sick. A woman seated across the aisle leaned over and whispered, "Don't take it personally. Some people just love to show their power." Her tone was sympathetic, but her words felt hollow. Nina offered a polite nod, but her thoughts were racing. She glanced around the cabin, noticing the way some passengers were openly staring now. Others averted their eyes, pretending to be engrossed in their phones or books. The murmurs started again. Now, indistinct whispers that seemed to ripple through the cabin. As the plane began to ascend, the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. Nina caught snippets of conversations, phrases like "causing trouble" and "some people don't know how to act." Her stomach churned, and she turned toward James, who was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began moving around. James stood briefly to stretch, and as he did, a man from 2 rows behind leaned forward and muttered, "Sit down. Don't need you making a fuss." James froze, then slowly turned his head. "Excuse me?" His voice was measured but firm. The man looked startled but quickly recovered, waving a dismissive hand. "You heard me. Just trying to keep things calm." Nina tugged James's sleeve, her eyes pleading. "Let it go," she whispered. James sat back down, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. "This isn't right," he muttered. Nina nodded, her heart pounding. She glanced toward the back of the plane, where 2 flight attendants were huddled together, occasionally glancing their way. A few minutes later, one of the attendants approached again. Her face was neutral, but her tone carried an edge. "Sir, you've been moving around a lot. I need you to remain seated unless absolutely necessary." James stared at her, stunned. "I stood up for 10 seconds. That's all." The attendant's expression hardened. "We've had complaints from other passengers. Please follow the rules, or we'll have to take further action." Nina's mouth fell open in disbelief. "What complaints? He hasn't done anything wrong." The attendant ignored her, turning sharply and walking away. James leaned his head back against the seat, exhaling slowly. Around them, the murmurs grew louder, joined by occasional pointed looks. As the tension simmered, Nina felt her heart race. The whispers, the glances, the blatant targeting. It all felt like a storm building, ready to break. She looked at James, who was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. The calm they had hoped for on this flight had vanished. In its place was an oppressive, suffocating atmosphere that neither of them could escape. And yet, despite the mounting unease, Nina couldn't help but feel that this wasn't the end. Something bigger was coming. She just didn't know what. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a low drone that seemed to unleash the mounting tension. James sat stiffly in his seat, his jaw clenched and his hands resting on his thighs. Nina could see the effort he was making to remain calm, but she felt the same storm brewing inside herself. The flight attendants were nowhere to be seen for a moment, but their absence only amplified the whispers. Behind them, a couple of passengers were speaking just loud enough for Nina to catch snippets of their conversation. "Why do they always have to make everything about themselves?" one voice said. "Exactly. Some people just can't follow the rules," another chimed in. Nina's stomach twisted, a combination of anger and humiliation bubbling up. She tried to block out the words, but they stuck, sharp and biting. She turned her head, catching the eye of a woman sitting across the aisle. The woman quickly looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line. Moments later, the lead flight attendant returned, her expression a mixture of impatience and authority. She stopped at James and Nina's row again, her voice louder than necessary. "We've had multiple complaints about disruptive behavior. This is your final warning." James blinked in disbelief. "Disruptive behavior? We haven't done anything except sit here." His voice was calm but firm, a thin thread of frustration woven through it. The attendant folded her arms. "Sir, if you continue to argue, we'll have to take further action. The safety and comfort of our passengers are our top priorities." Nina couldn't hold back any longer. "Comfort?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What about our comfort? We've done nothing wrong, and you're singling us out." The attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to calm down. This will be the last time I say it." At this, other passengers began to murmur louder. Some seemed to support the couple, while others muttered agreement with the crew's actions. One man leaned forward from a few rows back and called out, "Why don't you just follow the rules like everyone else?" James turned sharply. "We are following the rules. The question is, why are we being treated differently?" The man smirked. "Maybe because you're making it about yourselves." Before James could respond, Nina grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They want us to react. Don't give them what they want." But it was too late. The murmurs were now a cacophony of voices, some arguing in defense of the couple, others siding with the crew or simply complaining about the delay. The flight attendant raised her hands, calling for quiet, but the cabin felt like it was spinning out of control. James took a deep breath, his voice cutting through the noise. "We've been polite. We've complied with every request. But enough is enough. We deserve to be treated with the same respect as anyone else on this plane." For a moment, the cabin fell silent. Nina felt her chest tighten as she glanced at the passengers around them. Some were nodding, others whispering to one another. The tension was palpable. Just as it seemed things might de-escalate, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some passenger issues. We're going to return to the gate to ensure everyone's safety and comfort." Gasps rippled through the cabin. A woman near the front groaned, "Bah, come on. This is ridiculous." Another passenger muttered, "All this over nothing." Nina's heart sank. She could feel the collective frustration of the passengers turning toward her and James. The flight attendant gave them one last withering look before marching back up the aisle. As the plane turned back toward the terminal, Nina felt tears prick her eyes. James took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "We'll get through this," he whispered, his voice low but resolute. The plane came to a stop, and soon the doors opened. Two uniformed airport security officers boarded, their faces unreadable as they walked down the aisle. The entire cabin watched in tense silence. Nina's pulse pounded in her ears as they stopped at their row. "Sir, ma'am," one of them said, his tone professional but cold, "please gather your belongings and come with us." Nina felt a wave of disbelief and anger surge through her. "We didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice breaking. James stood, his expression calm but defiant. "We'll go," he said firmly. "But this isn't over." As they stepped into the aisle, the whispers erupted again, louder this time. Some passengers looked sympathetic, others openly disdainful. A few clapped sarcastically as they walked by, the sound cutting through Nina like a knife. When they reached the front of the plane, James turned back, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "To those who supported us, thank you. To those who didn't, you should think about why." With that, they stepped off the plane, the doors closing behind them. The cabin buzzed with conversation, but James and Nina were already gone, stepping into a sterile airport corridor that suddenly felt like an entirely different world. Nina wiped at her eyes as James wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "They might have humiliated us," he said softly, "but this isn't the end. Not by a long shot." And though her heart was heavy, Nina felt a flicker of something else: determination. As James and Nina followed the two uniformed airport security officers down the long, brightly lit corridor, the sterile silence of the terminal felt oppressive. Each step echoed, a stark contrast to the chaotic murmurs they had left behind on the plane. Nina's hand tightened around her carry-on strap as she struggled to process what had just happened. The officers led them into a small, windowless room with white walls and a single table surrounded by chairs. The air was cold, almost clinical. One of the officers gestured toward the seats without making eye contact. "Please have a seat." James and Nina exchanged a glance. James spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "We'd like to understand why we were removed from the flight." The officer, a tall man with a clipped tone, opened a folder and began flipping through papers. "We received a report from the flight crew about disruptive behavior. For the safety and comfort of all passengers, the captain made the decision to remove you." "Disruptive?" James asked, his voice rising slightly. We complied with every request. We were polite, even when we were being unfairly targeted. Nina leaned forward, her voice trembling. We were disruptive. We were humiliated, singled out, and we both know why. The second officer, a younger woman, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The first officer cleared his throat, avoiding eye contact. "This isn't about," James interrupted, his voice resolute. "It is about that. Let's not pretend it isn't." The tension in the room was palpable. Nina's chest tightened as she watched the officers fumble for a response. For a moment, silence filled the space, heavy and unyielding. Finally, the younger officer spoke, her voice softer. "We understand your frustration, but our role is to ensure compliance with airline policy." Nina exhaled sharply. Compliance? The policies weren't the problem. It's how they were applied, to us and only us. The older officer stood abruptly. "We'll file a report and notify the airline. You're free to contact their customer service for further action." James shook his head, his voice steady. "A report isn't enough. We were publicly humiliated, and no one cared to stop it. This isn't just going away." The officer hesitated before nodding curtly and leaving the room, the younger officer following close behind. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving James and Nina alone. Nina leaned her elbows on the table, burying her face in her hands. "I can't believe this is happening." James reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "We're not staying silent, Nina. They want us to let this slide, to go home and forget about it. But we won't." She looked up, meeting his determined gaze. "What do we do?" James leaned back in his chair, the wheels already turning. "We document everything, write down exactly what happened, and then we tell our story, to the airline, to the media, to anyone who will listen." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A woman in a sleek black suit entered, her expression professional but unreadable. "Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, I'm Karen Walsh, a representative from the airline. I understand there was an incident on board." Nina felt a spark of hope, but James's expression remained guarded. "That's putting it lightly," he said. Walsh took a seat across from them, placing a tablet and a notepad on the table. "I'm here to gather information and address your concerns." "Address our concerns?" Nina repeated, her voice tinged with skepticism. "What are you going to do about the public humiliation we just endured?" Walsh hesitated, her professional mask slipping for a moment. "I assure you, we take these matters seriously, but I need to hear your side of the story." James recounted everything, his voice steady and measured. Nina chimed in occasionally, her tone wavering with emotion. Walsh listened intently, taking notes and nodding occasionally. When they finished, she folded her hands. "Thank you for sharing your experience. We'll launch an internal investigation and reach out to you with the findings." "That's not enough," James said firmly. "We don't want an internal investigation buried in your files. We want accountability, public accountability." Walsh's professional demeanor faltered. "I'll escalate your concerns to the appropriate channels. In the meantime, I'd recommend avoiding public statements until we've had a chance to resolve this." Nina sat up straighter. "Avoid public statements? You're asking us to stay silent." "I'm asking you to let us handle this," Walsh replied, her tone even but firm. James shook his head. "We've heard enough. If you want to handle this, do it publicly. Otherwise we will." Walsh stood, smoothing her skirt. "I'll pass your concerns along. You'll hear from us soon." She left the room without another word. As the door closed, James turned to Nina. "We're going to make sure the world hears this story. No more waiting." Nina nodded, a flicker of determination replacing her earlier despair. "We'll fight this, together." And with that, the seed of their next step was planted. The fight was far from over, and they were just getting started. James and Nina left the small interrogation room, their minds racing as they walked silently through the terminal. The bright fluorescent lights felt harsh, exposing every raw emotion etched on their faces. People bustled around them, unaware, or perhaps uninterested, in the quiet storm brewing in the couple's hearts. As they approached a seating area near the gates, James paused. "Let's sit for a moment," he said, guiding Nina to a bench. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling, his face set with determination. "What are you looking for?" Nina asked, her voice still shaky. "Contact information for a lawyer," James replied. "This isn't something we can let slide. We need to make it official." Nina nodded, though she felt a knot of anxiety in her chest. "Do you think anyone will care? Will they listen?" James placed a reassuring hand on hers. "They'll listen because we'll make them listen." Nearby, a woman in her late 40s sat quietly, watching them with a curious expression. After a moment, she stood and approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I couldn't help but overhear. Were you the couple they removed from the flight?" James and Nina exchanged a glance before nodding. The woman sighed, her face filled with sympathy. "I saw the way they treated you. It wasn't right. I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Nina's eyes welled with tears. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that." The woman hesitated before continuing. "If you're planning to fight this, you're not alone. People need to know what happened. The airline shouldn't get away with treating people like this." James's expression softened. "Thank you. It helps to know someone noticed." The woman reached into her purse and handed them a business card. "My name's Linda. I work with a local advocacy group. If you need support, or if you want to share your story, please call me." James took the card and studied it, his resolve strengthening. "We'll be in touch." As Linda walked away, Nina leaned into James. "Maybe we're not alone in this," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of hope and uncertainty. James nodded. "We're going to need all the support we can get." Later that evening, back at their hotel room, the couple sat side by side on the bed, their laptops open. Nina was drafting a detailed account of the incident while James compiled a list of contacts, lawyers, advocacy groups, and media outlets. "This needs to be airtight," Nina said as she reread her notes. "Every detail, every word they said to us." James nodded, his focus unbroken. "We're not just telling our story. We're starting a conversation." Their phones buzzed with messages from friends and family who had heard about the incident. Some offered support, while others cautioned them to be careful and not make it worse. "What do they mean, make it worse?" Nina asked, shaking her head. "It's already bad." James placed a hand on her shoulder. "They're scared. But that's why we have to do this. If we don't speak up, who will?" Nina took a deep breath and returned to her notes. "Okay," she said. "Let's do this." The next morning, James posted a brief statement on social media. The caption read, "Yesterday, my wife and I experienced blatant discrimination on a flight. We were humiliated, targeted, and removed without cause. This isn't just about us. It's about every person who has been silenced or ignored. We won't let this go unnoticed. Our story needs to be heard." Within hours, the post began to gain traction. Comments flooded in, some expressing outrage and support, others dismissing their claims or accusing them of overreacting. Nina read through the responses, her emotions swinging between hope and frustration. One comment caught her attention. "I was on that flight. I saw what happened. I'm with you." "James," she said, pointing to the screen. "Look at this." James leaned over, his eyebrows raising as he read. "If we can get witnesses to speak out, it'll add weight to our story." He responded to the comment, asking the person to reach out privately. Minutes later, a message arrived in his inbox. The sender introduced themselves as a fellow passenger and described in detail what they had witnessed. "It was obvious," the message read. "The crew treated you differently from the start. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't know what to do at the time. I'm sorry." James looked at Nina, his jaw set. This is the first of many. People saw. They know. By evening, their story was spreading across social media. Advocacy groups began reaching out, offering support and connections to media outlets. Journalists contacted James, eager for interviews. One major news outlet requested an on-camera interview, which James and Nina reluctantly agreed to. "This is bigger than us now," James said as they prepared for the interview. "If we stay silent, we're letting them win." Nina nodded, though her nerves were evident. "I just hope we're ready for what comes next." James placed a hand on her cheek, his voice steady. "We are." As the camera lights flicked on and the reporter began to speak, Nina took a deep breath. Their journey for justice was just beginning, and the world was finally watching. The day after their story began to gain traction online, James and Nina found themselves navigating uncharted territory. Their inboxes were flooded with messages of both support and vitriol. Advocacy groups and legal firms had reached out, offering assistance, while detractors accused them of exaggerating or playing the victim card. It was a storm they hadn't fully anticipated, but they were determined to weather it. Sitting in their hotel room, James sifted through emails while Nina scrolled through social media. Every few minutes, she would stop to read a particularly supportive comment aloud, hoping to buoy their spirits. "Listen to this," she said, her voice tinged with cautious hope. "I was a passenger on the same flight, and I saw everything. It was wrong. I stand with you." James smiled faintly, but kept his focus on the screen in front of him. "That's good," he said. "We need more witnesses willing to come forward." Their lawyer, a young but sharp civil rights attorney named Carla Green, had arranged a press conference for later that afternoon. Carla had been a beacon of calm and clarity in the chaos, guiding them through the legal and public relations maze. At noon, they arrived at a small conference room rented by Carla's firm. A handful of journalists milled about, setting up cameras and microphones. Carla greeted them at the door, her demeanor professional but warm. "You ready?" she asked, her sharp eyes scanning their faces. "As ready as we'll ever be," James replied, gripping Nina's hand. Carla led them to a table at the front of the room. Microphones were already set up, and a banner behind them bore the firm's logo. James adjusted his tie, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The press conference began with Carla outlining the incident in detail. She spoke with precision, her words carefully chosen to paint a clear picture of what had transpired. "This is not an isolated event," she said, her voice firm. "This is a symptom of a larger issue, one that we as a society must confront." When it was James and Nina's turn to speak, the room fell silent. James began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We didn't ask for this fight," he said. "But when injustice happens, silence isn't an option. What happened to us could happen to anyone, and it's happening too often." Nina followed, her voice trembling but resolute. "We were humiliated, treated like criminals, for no reason other than who we are. This isn't just about us. It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong." The journalists began asking questions, some supportive, others pointed. One reporter asked, "Do you think this is being blown out of proportion? Airlines deal with disruptive passengers all the time." James didn't flinch. "This isn't about disruption. It's about discrimination. If we were disruptive, show us the evidence. But there is none, because it didn't happen." The response was met with murmurs of approval from some journalists, while others scribbled notes furiously. The atmosphere was charged, but James and Nina held their ground. After the press conference, Carla pulled them aside. "You both did great," she said, "but things are going to heat up now. Be prepared for pushback, especially from the airline." As if on cue, their phones buzzed simultaneously. It was a notification from a news app. Airline issues statement denying wrongdoing and passenger incident. Nina's heart sank as she read the headline aloud. "They're calling us liars," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James clenched his jaw. "Let them. The truth is on our side." Carla placed a reassuring hand on Nina's shoulder. "This was expected. Their first move is always denial. But we have witnesses, video evidence, and growing support online. We're building momentum." That evening, James and Nina sat in their hotel room once again, this time reviewing footage that had surfaced online. A fellow passenger had secretly recorded parts of the incident, capturing the flight attendant's hostile tone in the couple's calm responses. "This changes everything," James said, his eyes lighting up. "This is proof." The video quickly spread across social media, sparking a firestorm of reactions. Hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #StandWithJames and Nina began trending, and prominent activists and celebrities joined the conversation. Nina scrolled through the comments, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "People are finally seeing what we've been saying," she said softly. James nodded, but his expression remained serious. "This is just the beginning. We've got a long way to go." The next morning, the couple appeared on a major morning talk show. The host, a seasoned journalist known for her probing questions, didn't hold back. "There are critics who say you're overreacting," she said. "What do you say to them?" James leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "To those critics, I'd ask, what would you do if this happened to you? Would you stay silent? Or would you fight for your dignity?" The host nodded, visibly moved. "What's next for you two?" Nina glanced at James before answering. "We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for change, for accountability, and we won't stop until we get it." The interview ended with a standing ovation from the studio audience. As James and Nina walked off the set, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but they were no longer alone. They had sparked a movement, and the world was beginning to listen. The next few days brought a whirlwind of events. As James and Nina's story spread, so did the airline's efforts to defend itself. Press releases from the airline portrayed the couple as aggressive and uncooperative, citing vague complaints from unnamed passengers. News outlets began airing debates about the incident, with some commentators questioning the couple's motives. Sitting in their hotel room, James and Nina watched one such segment on TV. A panelist, a well-known pundit, sneered at their story. "This is just another case of people looking for attention," he said dismissively. "If they didn't like the rules, they shouldn't have flown." Nina turned off the TV, her hands trembling. How can they say that? They weren't even there. James placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "They're trying to shift the narrative. They want people to doubt us, to make this about something it's not." "But it hurts," Nina admitted, her voice breaking. "It feels like we're fighting a losing battle." James knelt in front of her, his gaze steady. "We're not losing, Nina. We're making noise. That's why they're pushing back so hard. It means we're getting to them." The following morning, Carla called with an update. "The airline is doubling down," she said, her tone serious. "They've released a statement saying they have witness testimonies supporting their claims." Nina's heart sank. That's not true. We've heard from witnesses who support us." Carla's voice softened. "It's a common tactic. They're trying to confuse the public and undermine your credibility. But we have something they don't. The video evidence. Is it enough?" James asked, his tone measured but intense. "It's a strong start," Carla replied. "But we need more. I've spoken to additional passengers who are willing to come forward. If we can get their testimonies on record, it will strengthen your case." James nodded. "Let's do it. Whatever it takes." Later that day, James and Nina met with 3 passengers who had been on the flight. Each of them described witnessing the discriminatory treatment the couple endured. One, a middle-aged man named Robert, shared his story with tears in his eyes. "I didn't say anything at the time," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "I was scared of causing trouble, but I knew it was wrong. I should have stood up for you." James placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "It's not too late to stand up. Your voice matters." The other witnesses nodded in agreement, their resolve growing. Carlo recorded their statements, ensuring every detail was documented. Meanwhile, social media continued to buzz. Prominent activists and public figures lent their voices to the cause, amplifying the couple's story. Celebrities tweeted their support, and hashtags like #JusticeForJames and Nina and #InFlight Discrimination trended globally. But with the increased attention came more scrutiny. Online trolls bombarded James and Nina with hateful messages, accusing them of fabricating the incident for fame or money. Nina struggled to hold back tears as she read some of the comments. "Maybe we should take a break from this," she said one evening, her voice barely audible. "It's too much." James wrapped an arm around her, his voice gentle but resolute. "I know it's hard, but if we stop now, they win. This fight isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's ever been silenced." Nina wiped her eyes and nodded. "You're right. We can't back down." As the public debate raged on, Carla called with another update. "I've got good news," she said. "A major civil rights organization wants to partner with us. They're offering resources, legal support, and a platform to amplify your story." James and Nina exchanged a look of relief. "That's incredible," James said. "With their help, we can make real progress." Carla agreed. But it also means the stakes are higher. The airline will fight even harder to protect its reputation. We need to stay vigilant. The next day, the civil rights organization held a rally in support of James and Nina. Hundreds of people gathered, holding signs with messages like "Stop Discrimination" and "Equality for All." James and Nina stood on a small stage, addressing the crowd. Nina spoke first, her voice trembling with emotion. "We didn't ask to be in this position. But now that we're here, we won't stop fighting. Not for ourselves, but for everyone who's ever felt invisible or powerless." James followed, his voice strong and steady. "This isn't just about one flight or one incident. It's about a culture that allows discrimination to go unchecked. Together, we can change that." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the city streets. For the first time in days, James and Nina felt a glimmer of hope. As they left the rally, James received a notification on his phone. It was an email from a high-ranking airline executive requesting a private meeting. "What do you think they want?" Nina asked, her brow furrowed. James stared at the screen, his mind racing. "I don't know. But whatever it is, we're not going in blind." The couple contacted Carla, who agreed to accompany them to the meeting. "This could be a turning point," she said. "But we have to be careful. They'll try to control the narrative." James nodded, his expression resolute. "We've come this far. We're not backing down now." And with that, they prepared for the next chapter in their fight for justice. The next morning, James and Nina arrived at the airline's corporate headquarters, a sleek glass building towering over the city. Carla met them in the lobby, dressed in a sharp navy suit that exuded confidence. She handed them a folder with key points they had prepared. "Remember," Carla said firmly, "this is a strategic move on their part. They're not doing this out of kindness. They're protecting their reputation." James nodded, gripping Nina's hand. "We're ready." They were escorted into a large, minimalist conference room. A long table stretched before them, lined with leather chairs. At the far end sat two airline executives, their faces carefully composed, alongside a legal representative. A PR manager hovered nearby, clipboard in hand. "Thank you for coming," said the senior executive, a polished man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair. "We appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter directly." James and Nina exchanged a glance. The tone was polite, but the air crackled with tension. Carla spoke first, her voice steady and professional. "Let's be clear," she began. "We're here because my clients were subjected to discriminatory treatment, and the public deserves accountability. What does the airline intend to do about this?" The executive cleared his throat. "We've reviewed the incident thoroughly. While we regret any discomfort caused, our staff acted within company policy to ensure passenger safety and comfort." Nina felt a surge of anger. "Discomfort," she interjected. "We were humiliated, targeted, and removed for no reason other than bias. How is that within policy?" The legal representative stepped in, his tone measured. "The reports from the flight crew indicate that their actions were necessary to maintain order on the plane." James leaned forward, his voice firm. "Then show us those reports. Show us the evidence. Because we have video proof that says otherwise." The PR manager shifted uncomfortably, scribbling notes on her clipboard. The senior executive held up a hand. "Let's not escalate this further. We're prepared to offer compensation as a gesture of goodwill, free flights, a public apology, and a settlement to avoid further legal action." Carla's eyes narrowed. "A settlement without admitting fault? That's not accountability. My clients deserve more than a token apology. The public deserves transparency." The tension in the room thickened. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. The senior executive sighed. "What exactly are you asking for?" James spoke up, his voice clear and unwavering. "We want real change. Public acknowledgement of what happened. A commitment to anti-discrimination training for your staff. And a promise that no one else will go through what we did." The legal representative frowned. "Those are significant demands. Implementing such changes takes time and resources." Nina met his gaze, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "So does rebuilding trust. Right now, the public sees a company that protects its own interests at the expense of its passengers. Is that the legacy you want? The room fell silent. Carla seized the moment. If your airline truly values its customers, you'll take this opportunity to lead by example. This is your chance to do the right thing. After what felt like an eternity, the senior executive nodded slowly. We'll need to discuss this internally, but we're open to exploring your proposals. Carla stood, signaling the meeting's end. We'll be waiting for your formal response. But make no mistake, this issue isn't going away. As they left the room, James and Nina felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Carla turned to them, her expression serious but hopeful. They're rattled. That's a good sign. But we need to keep the pressure on. Later that evening, James and Nina joined a live virtual panel hosted by a prominent civil rights organization. Activists, legal experts, and other victims of discrimination shared their experiences. The couple's story resonated deeply, sparking an outpouring of support in the comments section. During the panel, James addressed the audience directly. This isn't just about us. It's about a system that allows bias to thrive unchecked. But change is possible if we hold institutions accountable. Nina added, we're fighting for a world where no one has to feel powerless. And we can't do it alone. Your voices matter. The panel ended with a standing ovation from the virtual audience. Messages of solidarity flooded in, further galvanizing their resolve. The next day, the airline issued a public statement. In it, they acknowledged the need for improvement and announced plans to implement mandatory diversity and bias training for all employees. While they didn't admit fault outright, the shift in tone marked a significant step forward. James and Nina read the statement together, their emotions mixed. It's progress, Nina said softly, but it's not the end. James nodded. We keep going. This fight is bigger than us. Their journey wasn't over, but the cracks in the system were beginning to show. With each step forward, they grew more determined to turn their pain into progress, one victory at a time. As news of the airline's public statement spread, the response was polarizing. Supporters applauded the couple's persistence and the airline's initial steps toward reform. Critics, however, grew louder, accusing James and Nina of seeking attention or financial gain. Social media was ablaze with heated debates, and news channels aired panels dissecting every aspect of the story. In their hotel room, James scrolled through his phone, his jaw tightening as he read some of the more vicious comments. Why don't they just let it go? He read aloud, his tone dripping with sarcasm. This is why people don't take them seriously. Nina sighed, setting down her laptop. I don't understand how people can be so cruel. We're fighting for justice, not fame. Carla, who had joined them to strategize, looked up from her notes. Unfortunately, the louder your voice gets, the more pushback you'll face. It's a sign that you're making an impact. But it's exhausting, Nina admitted. Every time we gain ground, it feels like someone's trying to tear us down. Carla nodded sympathetically. That's why we need to focus on the long-term goal. The airline's statement was a step, but we need more than promises. We need results. Later that day, James and Nina held a private Zoom call with other victims of airline discrimination who had reached out after hearing their story. One by one, people shared their experiences, being treated unfairly, feeling invisible, and being dismissed when they tried to speak up. A young woman named Maria, her voice trembling, recounted her ordeal. I was traveling with my kids, and the flight attendant treated us like we didn't belong. When I complained, they threatened to remove me from the flight. James listened intently, his heart heavy with empathy. Maria, your story matters, he said. We're going to make sure it's heard. The call ended with a renewed sense of purpose. James and Nina realized their fight wasn't just about their own experience. It was about the countless others who had suffered in silence. Meanwhile, the airline continued to navigate the fallout. Internally, employees were divided. Some supported the company's attempts to address bias, while others bristled at the implication that discrimination existed within their ranks. Leaks from staff meetings began to surface online, revealing heated discussions and resistance to the proposed reforms. One such leak caught James and Nina's attention. A recording of a flight attendant's meeting featured an employee angrily declaring, "This isn't about bias. It's about people trying to play the victim." Nina felt her stomach churn as she listened. "This is exactly the attitude we're fighting against," she said, her voice filled with frustration. James nodded, his resolve hardening. "It shows how deep the problem goes. This isn't just about policies, it's about changing the culture." Determined to keep the momentum alive, James and Nina collaborated with the civil rights organization on a new campaign. #Take Action Now, aimed at pushing the airline to turn its promises into concrete changes. The campaign included petitions, testimonials from victims, and a public call for transparency in the airline's reforms. The response was overwhelming. Within days, the petition garnered tens of thousands of signatures. Stories from other passengers flooded social media, each one adding weight to the campaign's demands. One evening, as James and Nina reviewed the campaign's progress, Carla called with surprising news. "The airline CEO wants to meet with you, publicly." James raised an eyebrow. "Publicly? That's a bold move." Carla's tone was cautious. "It's a PR strategy, but it could also be an opportunity. If they're willing to engage publicly, we can push for more accountability." Nina hesitated. "Do you think they're serious? Or is this just damage control?" From the past. "Probably a bit of both. But if we approach it strategically, we can make it work to our advantage." The public meeting was set to take place in a week, at a neutral venue with media attendance. In the days leading up to it, James and Nina prepared meticulously. They rehearsed their statements, studied the airline's policies, and worked with Carla to anticipate potential challenges. As the day approached, the tension grew. Online speculation was rampant, with some praising the couple's courage and others doubting their motives. Despite the noise, James and Nina stayed focused on their mission. On the day of the meeting, they arrived at the venue to find a throng of reporters, activists, and spectators. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of anticipation and scrutiny. Cameras flashed as James and Nina entered the room, accompanied by Carla. At the front of the room, the airline CEO, a composed woman in her early 60s, stood waiting. She extended a hand, her expression neutral. "Thank you for coming." James shook her hand firmly. "Thank you for agreeing to this." The meeting began with opening statements. The CEO acknowledged the airline's shortcomings and reiterated their commitment to addressing bias. James and Nina listened intently, waiting for their turn. When James spoke, his voice was steady but impassioned. "This isn't just about words or promises. It's about action. Real, measurable change. That's what we, and so many others, are asking for." Nina followed, her voice trembling with emotion but resolute. "We didn't choose this fight, but we won't walk away from it. Too many people have suffered in silence. It's time for that to end." The room fell silent, the weight of their words hanging in the air. As the meeting continued, the couple fielded questions from the media and engaged in a candid dialogue with the CEO. By the end, while no definitive agreement had been reached, one thing was clear. The conversation was far from over, and the world was watching. As they left the venue, James turned to Nina. "We've come so far, but there's still so much to do." Nina nodded, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "And we'll keep going. For us, and for everyone who needs to be heard." The morning after the public meeting, the media's coverage was relentless. Every major outlet dissected the interaction between James, Nina, and the airline's CEO. Analysts debated whether the airline's promises were genuine or performative. Social media was equally ablaze, with hashtags like #JusticeForJames and Nina and #AccountabilityNow trending for the third consecutive day. Back in their hotel room, James and Nina reviewed the coverage with Carla. "This is exactly what we needed," Carla said, her tone optimistic. "The meeting put the airline on the defensive and kept the focus on your story." James nodded, though his expression remained serious. "It's progress, but promises mean nothing without follow-through." Carla smiled knowingly. "That's where we hold their feet to the fire. The next steps are crucial." Later that afternoon, James and Nina received an unexpected email from a senior employee at the airline, an internal whistleblower. The subject line read, "You need to see this." Nina's heart raced as James opened the email. Inside was a series of internal memos detailing the airline's attempts to downplay the couple's claims, casting them as overly emotional and seeking attention. One memo even included strategies to shift public focus away from the incident by highlighting unrelated positive stories about the airline. "This is disgusting," Nina said, her voice shaking with anger. "They're trying to smear us." Carla examined the documents, her face grim. "This is damning. If we make this public, it'll expose their hypocrisy." James agreed, "But we need to do it carefully. We can't let this turn into a media circus." That evening, Carla coordinated with trusted journalists to release the memos alongside a statement from James and Nina. The couple's words were measured but powerful. "These documents reveal a disturbing effort to silence us and avoid accountability. This isn't just about us. It's about a systemic issue that affects countless others. We won't be silenced, and we won't stop fighting for justice." Within hours, the story exploded. News outlets ran headlines like "Airline Scandal Deepens with Leaked Memos" and "Whistleblower Exposes Airline's Discrimination Cover-Up." Public outrage grew, with even some of the airline's defenders now calling for answers. Meanwhile, employees within the airline began to speak out. A flight attendant anonymously posted on social media, describing a toxic culture where bias was ignored and employees were pressured to prioritize the company's image over fairness. The post went viral, further fueling the backlash. James and Nina's inbox was inundated with messages from current and former airline employees. One particularly poignant email came from a retired pilot who admitted to witnessing similar incidents over his career, but feeling powerless to intervene. "I stayed silent for too long," he wrote, "but your courage has inspired me to speak up. Thank you for not giving up." As the pressure mounted, the airline announced an emergency town hall meeting for its employees. James, Nina, and Carla watched the live stream with bated breath. The CEO, visibly tense, acknowledged the leaked memos and vowed to take immediate action. "We failed to live up to our values," she said, her voice wavering, "and for that, I'm deeply sorry. Moving forward, we are committed to creating a culture of accountability and inclusion." Her words were met with mixed reactions. Some employees applauded, while others voiced skepticism. For James and Nina, it was a step in the right direction, but far from enough. The following day, Carla received a call from the airline's legal team. "They want to meet again," she told James and Nina. "This time, they're ready to negotiate." The meeting was held in a more informal setting, with fewer representatives on each side. The airline CEO began by apologizing directly to James and Nina. "We mishandled this situation," she admitted, "and we want to make things right." James listened carefully before responding. Words are a start, but actions are what matter. Over the next few hours, they hammered out a detailed agreement. The airline committed to implementing mandatory bias training for all employees, establishing an independent oversight board to handle discrimination complaints, and creating a public accountability report to track progress. Additionally, the airline agreed to compensate James and Nina, not as hush money, but as part of a broader reparative justice initiative for victims of discrimination. When the agreement was finalized, James and Nina felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had achieved what many thought was impossible, but the weight of their journey lingered. As they left the meeting, James turned to Nina. "We did it," he said softly. Nina smiled, though tears brimmed in her eyes. "We didn't just do it for us. We did it for everyone who's been through this." Carla placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You two have changed the game. This is more than a victory. It's a shift in the conversation." That evening, James and Nina held a press conference to share the results of the negotiation. Cameras flashed as they stood side by side, addressing the crowd. "This isn't just a win for us," James said. "It's a win for everyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. Together, we've shown that change is possible." Nina added, her voice filled with emotion. "This fight has been hard, but it's been worth it. And it's not over. We'll continue to advocate for accountability and fairness, not just in the skies, but everywhere." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in weeks, James and Nina felt a sense of closure. They knew there was still work to be done, but they had taken a stand, and the world had listened.